Recovered Pict captures from frontier observatories showed no single dramatic beginning. The earliest fragments were routine by the standards of the Eastern Fringe, shipping tallies with unexplained deficits, customs records noting unfamiliar alloys in local markets, devotional reports complaining of reduced attendance at imperial shrines, and testimonies from survey clerks who described foreign envoys speaking with unusual patience and precise economic knowledge. On several worlds near the Damocles Gulf, these signs appeared separately and were at first treated as ordinary symptoms of distance, corruption, and weak enforcement. Only when inquisitorial investigators compared trade ledgers, port manifests, and confiscated devices did a pattern emerge. Human frontier communities had not merely encountered isolated aliens. They had become entangled with an expanding interstellar power whose presence was reshaping loyalties, commerce, and political stability across the region. What later campaign records, naval dispatches, and xeno-threat assessments would identify as the Damocles Gulf Crusade had begun, before the first formal declaration of war, in quiet exchanges, tolerated markets, and the gradual erosion of imperial authority along the Gulf. The initial cause of the conflict did not lie in a single battlefield incident, but in the convergence of several frontier pressures that the Imperium regarded as inseparable from sedition. By the later years of the Tau's Second Sphere expansion, water-caste envoys had crossed the Damocles Gulf and established contact with human settlements in the Timbra subsector and nearby frontier zones. Trade followed. Alien goods and technologies circulated openly enough to attract notice, and on worlds already considered unstable or rebellious by the administratum, that commerce became politically dangerous. The issue was not simply that Xenos merchandise was present, it was that the flow of goods was accompanied by influence, promises of better order, and a visible alternative to the distant and punitive structures of imperial rule. In an empire where orthodoxy and obedience were treated as strategic necessities, commerce with aliens could not remain commerce for long. It became contamination, then evidence, then casus belli. This was made more serious by local conditions in the Lithesh sector and the broader Eastern Fringe. Imperial control there had already been weakened by Eldari piracy, warp instability, and the ordinary strain of governing worlds separated by immense distance and unreliable communication. These were not idealized, well-defended core territories. They were peripheral holdings where governors improvised, merchants stretched law when profit required it, and loyalty was often strongest when backed by immediate force. Into that environment came the Tau, whose method in this phase was not crude extermination, but deliberate insertion through diplomacy, exchange, and selective alignment with populations willing to listen. The Tau did not first appear to many frontier humans as apocalyptic invaders. They appeared as useful outsiders who could trade, negotiate, and empower local actors against neglect from afar. For the Imperium, that was in some ways more intolerable than open attack, because it threatened the ideological bond between subject and sovereign rather than merely the military perimeter. Inquisitorial inquiry transformed scattered suspicion into formal accusation. Investigators examining the affected frontier worlds found tangible evidence of Tau activity and of human participation in dealings forbidden by imperial law. Those findings mattered because they moved the problem out of rumour and into institutional response. Once the Inquisition and associated authorities concluded that the Tau represented a growing threat, the language around the matter hardened rapidly. The concern was no longer whether some merchants had profited from illicit exchange. It was whether a previously underappreciated alien polity was using diplomacy and commerce to destabilize imperial possession of the region. Cardinal Esau Gurney of Brimlock then called for a crusade to purge these Xenos presence, and that appeal converted frontier anxiety into a sanctioned military campaign. The war that followed therefore began as both a punitive expedition and a doctrinal correction. It was designed to destroy alien influence and to remind compromised human populations that withdrawal from imperial obedience would be answered with overwhelming force. The Crusade's assembly reflected that intention. Imperial records describe a force centered on roughly a dozen capital ships of the Imperial Navy, 5 provisional companies of space marines drawn from multiple chapters, and 19 Imperial Guard regiments, including a substantial contribution from Brimlock. This was not the mass of a galaxy-defining crusade, but it was a serious regional instrument, large enough to overawe frontier worlds and crush what was assumed to be a developing Xeno nuisance. That assumption was important. The force was organized like a punitive restoration campaign against a limited alien power and compromised human colonies, not as a mobilization against one of the great ancient enemies of the Imperium. Embedded in the Crusade's design was an underestimation of the Tau. The very existence of the campaign shows that Imperial authorities reacted swiftly by frontier standards, but the scale of the commitment suggests they believed speed and severity would be enough. Before the Crusade struck deep into Tau space, it moved first against human settlements where Imperial rule had already frayed. Garrus and Kleist were among the colonies where authority was reimposed. The pattern is instructive. The campaign did not open with abstract strategic maneuvering across empty stars. It opened with reconquest, arrests, and punishment. Individuals accused of dealings with the Tau were seized and judged under special assize before Crusade authorities. This phase established the moral grammar of the entire war. From the Imperial perspective, the fighting was not only against an alien species, but against apostasy, weakness, and compromise among humanity itself. The rebellion of frontier populations following contact with Tau emissaries confirmed the worst fears of Imperial institutions. The Tau were dangerous not merely because they possessed ships and weapons, but because they could persuade human subjects that life beyond strict Imperial domination was possible. That possibility had to be extinguished before it matured into a wider frontier realignment. Seen from the Tau side, the opening situation was very different. Their expansion across the Gulf had been shaped by the logic of the greater good and the practical habits of a young empire still discovering the scale of the wider galaxy. Early contacts with humans did not immediately reveal the full enormity of the Imperium. Frontier traders, pirates, renegades, and neglected colonists gave the impression of a fragmented human presence rather than a single civilization of immense age and reach. The Tau response in this period combined curiosity with calculated ambition. Watercaste diplomats worked where they could. Firecaste voices called for harder measures at times, but the broader policy remained one of integration and influence. The Tau therefore entered the prelude to the Crusade under conditions of partial ignorance. They had achieved local gains and drawn humans into their orbit, but they had not yet fully confronted what it meant to provoke a state capable of sending crusade fleets across interstellar gulfs simply to make an example of a border region. This asymmetry of understanding is one of the most important causes behind the event. The Imperium knew enough to fear contamination and revolt, but not enough to accurately judge the resilience and sophistication of the Tau military system. The Tau knew enough to expand and manipulate local discontent, but not enough to grasp the true magnitude, brutality, and endurance of Imperial retaliation. Each side misread the scale of the other in a different way. The Imperium saw a dangerous but still manageable upstart Xeno's presence. The Tau saw a harsh and sprawling human order that could perhaps be outmaneuvered on the frontier before it fully responded. The Crusade emerged precisely from that gap in perception. It was not merely a war over territory, it was the result of two expanding political systems encountering one another first through intermediaries, then through suspicion, and finally through formal violence once neither side could preserve ambiguity. Geography intensified everything. The Damocles Gulf itself was not just a name applied to a theatre map. It was a real barrier of space that shaped logistics, assumptions, and tempo. The frontier around it encouraged delay in recognition and distortion in judgment. Information travelled imperfectly. Local arrangements could persist for long periods before central power reacted. When reaction came, it often came in the form of concentrated violence meant to compensate for months or years of neglect. That broader imperial habit is visible in the prelude to this war. Once authorities decided the Tau presence represented a true threat, there was little appetite for limited correction. A crusade was launched, and the language surrounding it emphasized purgation. The cause, therefore, was partly ideological and partly structural. A decentralized problem had emerged in a region where the Imperium historically preferred to restore control through force once softer forms of control had already failed. The opening phase also reveals a crucial thematic point that would define the rest of the campaign. This was the first major military conflict between the Imperium and the Tau Empire. First conflicts are rarely clean. Both sides entered with incomplete intelligence, inherited assumptions, and institutional habits formed against very different enemies. The Imperium brought Crusade doctrine, punitive reflexes, and confidence in the authority of overwhelming violence. The Tau brought mobile expansion, diplomatic infiltration, and confidence in the utility of influence supported by disciplined warfare. The result was not immediate total war across every front, but a progressive sharpening of contact. Human colonies were reclaimed, suspected collaborators were punished. Imperial formations advanced toward zones where coexistence between human colonists and Tau had existed. The Crusade was already becoming more than a border correction, but neither side yet possessed the full experience that later stages of the conflict would impose. What makes this beginning especially important in historical terms is that the event did not arise from simple hatred alone, even though hatred would later sustain much of the fighting. Its origins lay in systems colliding through trade, governance, and incompatible claims to legitimacy. One state treated persuasion and incorporation as tools of expansion. The other treated foreign persuasion of its subjects as proof that extermination was justified. Once human rebellion, alien commerce, and inquisitorial verification converged, the threshold had been crossed. After that point, every ledger entry, every confiscated device, every testimony from a compromised colony ceased to be local evidence and became part of a larger strategic picture. The Imperium had identified a new organized Xenos competitor on the Eastern Fringe. The Tau had drawn sufficient attention to themselves that survival would now require more than diplomacy. By the time the Crusade formally moved, the quiet frontier phase was already over. The war had been conceptually decided before many of its soldiers ever saw the enemy. In retrospective scholarship, later interpretations add another layer, though this belongs more properly to later chapters. Some sources tied to later Tau reflection suggest that the Ethereals may have been more willing to draw the Imperium into conflict than early appearances implied, believing that a contained confrontation could strengthen Tau understanding and resolve before humanity became fully aware of the Empire's scope. That interpretation remains bound to later insight and should not be allowed to distort the immediate historical sequence. In the immediate record of the opening, what is firmly established is simpler and stronger. Frontier trade spread. Human worlds grew receptive. Imperial investigators confirmed alien influence. Religious and political authorities demanded cleansing war. A crusade fleet was assembled. Imperial rule was reasserted over rebellious colonies. Only then did the campaign move from suppressed tension into overt interstellar conflict. So the beginning of the Damocles Gulf Crusade was not a sudden flash of battle light over a single planet. It was the product of patient infiltration, neglected frontiers, ideological intolerance, and institutional escalation. It began in records before it began in blood. It began in bargaining halls, warehouses, and port districts before it began in orbit. It began when the Imperium realized that alien influence had become politically effective among its own subjects, and when the Tau discovered that local success on the frontier could summon a far larger storm than their diplomats had first measured. That is the correct opening frame for the event. The first battles came after the diagnosis. The first shots came after the conclusion had already been written by investigators, priests, commanders, and governors. The Gulf could no longer remain a zone of uncertain contact. It had become a war frontier. The composition of forces that emerged during the opening phase of the Damocles Gulf Crusade reflected a convergence of imperial institutions operating under a unified directive, yet retaining their distinct doctrines and operational roles. The Imperial Navy formed the structural backbone of the campaign, responsible for void supremacy, long-range transport, orbital bombardment, and logistical continuity across the Gulf. Its capital ships, though limited in number compared to larger crusades, were sufficient to project authority over frontier systems that lacked the infrastructure or coordination to resist a concentrated naval presence. These vessels carried not only weapon systems of considerable destructive capacity, but also the means to enforce compliance from orbit, reducing settlements or fortifications that resisted reclamation. Accompanying the Navy were elements of the Adeptus Astartes, deployed in provisional formations drawn from multiple chapters. These Space Marines did not operate as a unified Legion-scale force, but rather as flexible strike contingents, each bringing its own combat doctrine, gene-line traditions and specialized capabilities. Their role within the Crusade was not to occupy territory in a sustained manner, but to conduct decisive assaults, eliminate hardened resistance, and destabilize enemy strongpoints ahead of broader Imperial Guard advances. Their presence also carried symbolic weight. In regions where Imperial authority had been weakened, the appearance of Astartes served as a direct reminder of the Imperium's capacity for overwhelming, uncompromising force. The Imperial Guard formed the bulk of the ground campaign. 19 regiments, including those raised from Brimlock, were tasked with the reclamation and stabilization of contested worlds. These regiments varied in composition, training and specialization, but collectively they represented the Imperium's primary means of sustained warfare. Where the Astartes struck with precision and intensity, the Guard advanced with endurance, establishing control through numbers, discipline and persistence. Their responsibilities extended beyond combat into occupation, enforcement, and the re-establishment of administrative order following the suppression of rebellion or alien presence. Opposing these imperial forces was the Tau Empire, specifically elements of its Second Sphere expansion. The Tau military structure differed fundamentally from that of the Imperium. It was organized into castes, each fulfilling defined roles within a broader societal and strategic framework. The Fire caste provided the primary combat forces, trained in coordinated ranged warfare, rapid deployment, and the integration of advanced battlesuit technology. The Earth caste supported engineering, construction, and technological development, ensuring that equipment, vehicles, and infrastructure could be produced and maintained efficiently, even in expanding frontier zones. The Air caste controlled spacefaring operations, including starships and atmospheric craft, enabling mobility and supply across vast distances. The Water caste managed diplomacy, negotiation, and cultural integration, playing a significant role in the earlier stages of expansion, where direct conflict was not yet the dominant method of interaction. Also present within Tau-aligned forces were auxiliary units, drawn from allied or integrated species. Among the most prominent were the Kroot, who served as adaptable infantry capable of operating in diverse environments, often deployed in roles requiring stealth, reconnaissance, or close-quarters engagement. Their biological adaptability and distinct combat methods contrasted with the disciplined, technology-driven approach of the Fire caste, providing the Tau with a degree of tactical flexibility that was not immediately apparent to Imperial observers during initial encounters. The first encounters between Imperial forces and the Tau during the Crusade were shaped by this imbalance of understanding and doctrine. Early contact often occurred in systems where Tau presence had already been established through diplomatic or economic means. In several instances, Imperial fleets entering such systems encountered not fortified war zones, but settlements where human populations coexisted with or had accepted Tau governance. These environments created immediate strategic and moral complications. From the Imperial perspective, such coexistence represented heresy and corruption. From the Tau perspective, it demonstrated the effectiveness of their expansion model. Initial engagements were therefore not always conventional battles. In some cases, Imperial commanders issued demands for compliance, expecting rapid submission once the authority of the Imperium was asserted. These expectations were not always met. Tau forces, though not yet fully mobilized for total war against the Imperium, demonstrated a capacity for organized resistance. Their use of ranged weaponry, coordinated unit tactics, and mobile deployment allowed them to contest Imperial advances more effectively than anticipated. Encounters that were expected to result in swift suppression instead revealed an opponent capable of disciplined engagement and adaptive response. As contact intensified, hostile encounters became more frequent and more structured. The Imperial advance into systems under Tau influence led to direct confrontations between Imperial Guard regiments and fire caste forces. These engagements highlighted significant differences in doctrine. Imperial forces relied heavily on massed infantry assaults, supported by armoured vehicles and artillery, emphasising attrition and sustained pressure. Tau forces, by contrast, prioritise mobility, precision, and the use of advanced targeting systems. Battlesuits equipped with jet-assisted movement allowed Tau units to engage, withdraw, and reposition rapidly, avoiding prolonged close combat where Imperial forces often held an advantage. Naval engagements also began to reveal the capabilities of the Tau. While the Imperium possessed a long-established naval tradition, with heavily armoured vessels and powerful macro-weaponry, Tau ships demonstrated efficiency in manoeuvre and coordination. Their approach to void combat emphasised positioning, combined arms integration between ship classes, and the use of advanced targeting systems. Although not immediately superior in raw durability, Tau fleets proved capable of contesting Imperial control of space in ways that challenged initial assumptions about their relative strength. One of the defining features of early hostile encounters was the Imperial response to human populations found under Tau influence. These encounters were not limited to alien forces. Imperial units frequently engaged with settlements deemed to be in a state of rebellion or contamination. The presence of Tau advisors, technology, or governance structures within these communities led to their classification as hostile or compromised. This resulted in punitive actions that included arrests, trials, and in some cases large-scale enforcement measures designed to reassert Imperial authority. These actions reinforced the ideological dimension of the conflict, where the war was as much about restoring orthodoxy as it was about defeating a military opponent. The escalation of hostilities was gradual but irreversible. Each encounter contributed to a growing recognition on both sides that the conflict would not remain limited. For the Imperium, the realization emerged that the Tau were not merely a minor Xenos presence, but an organized and expanding power with the capability to resist and adapt. For the Tau, the encounters revealed the scale and determination of Imperial response, forcing a transition from expansion through influence to defense through coordinated military action. By the latter stages of this phase, the nature of the war had shifted. Initial assumptions had been replaced by operational realities. Imperial forces had encountered resistance that required sustained engagement rather than rapid suppression. Tau forces had faced an adversary willing to commit significant resources to the eradication of their presence. The first encounters, shaped by incomplete understanding and cautious probing, gave way to hostile engagements defined by increasing intensity, clearer strategic objectives, and the beginning of a broader interstellar conflict that would extend beyond the immediate frontier systems. The interactions between these factions during the early stages of the Damocles Gulf Crusade established patterns that would persist throughout the campaign. Imperial reliance on overwhelming force, combined with doctrinal rigidity, contrasted with Tau adaptability, technological integration, and emphasis on coordinated action. The resulting engagements were neither entirely one-sided nor easily resolved. Instead, they formed a complex series of confrontations in which both sides learned, adjusted, and prepared for the continuation of a conflict that had already surpassed its initial expectations. As the campaign advanced beyond its initial phases of contact and localized engagement, the closing stage of the Damocles Gulf Crusade did not emerge as a decisive culmination in the conventional sense. Instead, it developed as a convergence of operational strain, strategic reassessment, and external pressures that forced both the Imperium and the Tau Empire into a position where continuation of the conflict became increasingly unsustainable within the original scope of the Crusade. Imperial forces, having pushed deeper into regions under Tau influence, began to encounter not only more organized resistance, but also the limitations of their own logistical framework. The Damocles Gulf, while serving as a gateway into Tau-controlled space, also imposed significant strain on supply lines. Reinforcement cycles lengthened, communication delays increased, and the coordination between fleet elements and ground forces became progressively more difficult to maintain at peak efficiency. The Crusade had been launched as a concentrated punitive effort, not as a prolonged war of expansion into unfamiliar and increasingly defended territory. Despite these constraints, Imperial forces achieved several early successes. Worlds previously influenced or aligned with the Tau were brought back under Imperial control, and in multiple engagements, Tau forces were forced into withdrawal or tactical retreat. The momentum of the Crusade carried Imperial formations further than initial projections had assumed, and for a period, it appeared that the campaign might achieve its intended objective of dismantling Tau presence within the contested region. However, as Imperial forces approached more established Tau holdings, the nature of resistance changed. Defensive positions became more structured, coordination between Tau units improved, and the integration of their technological assets became more pronounced. Battlesuits were deployed in greater numbers, aerial support became more consistent, and ground engagements reflected a level of preparation that had not been present during earlier encounters. The Tau were no longer responding as an expanding frontier power caught in transition. They were adapting into a defensive posture, shaped by the realities of sustained conflict against a larger and more aggressive adversary. The most significant shift occurred during the campaign's advance toward the Tau Sept worlds, particularly in the region surrounding Daleth. This area represented a deeper integration of Tau infrastructure, governance, and military coordination. Engagements in this phase demonstrated that the Tau were capable of organizing layered defenses, combining ground forces, aerial units, and orbital assets, in a manner that challenged the Imperial approach to warfare. The expectation of rapid suppression gave way to prolonged engagements requiring greater expenditure of resources and coordination than originally anticipated. At this stage, the Crusade reached a critical point of decision. Imperial forces were no longer operating solely within the parameters of a punitive expedition. They were approaching the threshold of a broader war that would require reinforcement, escalation, and a redefinition of strategic objectives. The capacity to continue advancing depended not only on battlefield performance, but on the availability of additional forces and the willingness of Imperial command structures to commit to a longer-term conflict in the region. It was within this context that external developments began to exert decisive influence. Reports reached Imperial command regarding a rapidly escalating threat elsewhere within the Imperium's domain. The emergence of Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first recorded Tyranid incursion on a scale that demanded immediate and overwhelming response, introduced a strategic priority that could not be ignored. The Tyranid threat represented an existential danger to multiple sectors, requiring the redeployment of forces and the concentration of military resources on a scale that exceeded the scope of the Damocles campaign. The arrival of this information fundamentally altered the calculus of the Crusade. Continuing the offensive against the Tau would require sustained commitment at a time when resources were urgently needed elsewhere. The Imperium, structured around the necessity of responding to multiple simultaneous threats, could not justify the extension of a regional campaign at the expense of addressing a rapidly advancing extragalactic invasion. The decision to withdraw was therefore not a consequence of immediate defeat on the battlefield, but a strategic reassignment driven by the broader priorities of Imperial survival. The withdrawal of Imperial forces was conducted in a manner that preserved the integrity of the Crusade's remaining assets. Naval elements disengaged, ground forces were extracted or redeployed, and the campaign was brought to a close without a final, decisive confrontation that would conclusively determine control over the contested region. The Damocles Gulf Crusade ended not with a definitive victory or defeat, but with an incomplete resolution shaped by circumstances beyond the immediate theatre of war. The overall result of the event can be understood as a strategic stalemate with asymmetrical consequences. The Imperium succeeded in reasserting control over several frontier worlds and in demonstrating its capacity to respond decisively to perceived threats, It disrupted Tau expansion in the immediate region and reinforced the principle that alien influence within human domains would be met with force. However, it did not achieve the complete eradication of Tau presence or the long-term neutralization of their expansionist potential. For the Tau Empire, the outcome was equally complex. While they were forced to confront the scale and intensity of Imperial military response, they also gained critical experience in large-scale warfare against one of the most formidable powers in the galaxy. The conflict exposed weaknesses in their early expansion strategies, particularly the assumption that influence and integration could proceed without provoking overwhelming retaliation. At the same time, it validated the effectiveness of their military doctrines when properly coordinated and supported. The ability to withstand a Crusade-scale offensive, even if only temporarily, marked a significant point in the development of Tau's strategic identity. Several key findings emerge from the analysis of the Damocles Gulf Crusade. The first is the confirmation that initial assumptions held by both sides were incomplete or inaccurate. The Imperium underestimated the organizational capacity and technological sophistication of the Tau, treating them as a minor Xenos threat rather than an emerging power capable of sustained resistance. The Tau, in turn, underestimated the scale, persistence, and ideological rigidity of Imperial response, failing to fully anticipate the consequences of engaging with human frontier populations. The second finding concerns the role of doctrine in shaping battlefield outcomes. Imperial reliance on massed force and attritional warfare proved effective in early engagements, but encountered limitations when facing a mobile, technologically integrated opponent. Tau emphasis on coordination, precision, and adaptability allowed them to mitigate some of these disadvantages, particularly in defensive scenarios. The interaction between these doctrines produced a pattern of engagements that were neither uniformly predictable nor easily resolved. The third finding relates to the importance of logistics and strategic prioritization. The Crusade demonstrated that even a force as vast as the Imperium is constrained by the necessity of allocating resources across multiple threats. The emergence of the Tyranid incursion forced a re-evaluation of priorities, illustrating that no single campaign, regardless of its immediate importance, exists in isolation from the broader strategic environment. Finally, the Crusade established a precedent for future interactions between the Imperium and the Tau Empire. It marked the transition from indirect contact and limited engagement to open, large-scale conflict. The lessons learned during this campaign would influence subsequent military planning, diplomatic posture, and strategic assumptions on both sides. The Damocles Gulf Crusade did not resolve the question of dominance in the Eastern Fringe. It defined the parameters within which that question would continue to be contested. In closing, the Damocles Gulf Crusade stands as an event characterized not by a singular decisive moment, but by a sequence of developments that collectively reshaped the relationship between two expanding powers. Its conclusion reflects the realities of a galaxy in which conflicts are often interrupted rather than concluded, and where outcomes are determined as much by external pressures as by the actions of those directly involved. The war did not end because one side achieved total victory. It ended because the conditions that sustained it were overtaken by larger forces, leaving behind a contested frontier and a conflict that would continue in different forms beyond the scope of the initial crusade. Records preserved within the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus do not describe the Damocles Gulf Crusade as a failure of arms, but rather as an event that exposed structural realities about warfare on the Eastern Fringe that had previously been underestimated or inadequately documented. Early impressions recorded by administratum clerks, fleet logisticians, and attached Mechanicus adepts consistently reflect a transition in tone across the duration of the campaign. Initial entries describe confidence in projected timelines, manageable resistance expectations, and the assumption that the target theatre contained a fragmented and technologically inferior Xenos presence. Later entries show a steady revision of these assumptions, accompanied by increasingly detailed notes on supply strain, unexpected resistance patterns, and the need for doctrinal adaptation. Administratum observers place significant emphasis on the discrepancy between projected compliance rates and actual resistance encountered. In frontier reclamation campaigns, statistical models typically assumed that a visible demonstration of Imperial naval power, followed by targeted enforcement, would result in rapid submission from compromised populations. However, in systems influenced by the Tau, compliance rates were measurably lower than expected. Reports indicate that human populations previously exposed to Tau governance structures exhibited reduced responsiveness to Imperial authority, particularly in the early phases of contact. This was interpreted not only as evidence of sedition, but as an indication that Tau integration methods had achieved a degree of local stability that complicated traditional enforcement strategies. Mechanicus records approach the same phenomenon from a different perspective. Rather than focusing on ideological deviation, they analyze the material and infrastructural conditions observed on these worlds. In several cases, Mechanicus survey teams documented efficient distribution networks, standardized construction patterns, and the presence of modular technological systems that could be maintained with relatively limited resources. While these systems were classified as xenos in origin, and therefore subject to doctrinal prohibition, their functional efficiency was noted with precision. The implication, though not explicitly stated in formal summaries, was that the Tau approach to expansion prioritized logistical sustainability in a manner that differed from Imperial norms, particularly in newly integrated or remote territories. Strategic findings from both institutions consistently highlight the adaptability of Tau military doctrine. Administratum analysts recorded that Tau forces demonstrated a pattern of engagement characterized by controlled exposure rather than sustained confrontation. Enemy units would engage at range, withdraw before decisive contact, and reposition to exploit weaknesses in advancing Imperial formations. This behavior complicated the predictive models used by Imperial command structures, which were often based on prior experience with enemies that favored either direct assault or static defense. The Tau approach introduced a level of operational fluidity that required continuous adjustment of tactical expectations. Mechanicus observers expanded on these findings by examining the technological systems that enabled such adaptability. Battlesuit platforms, for example, were documented as multi-role units capable of both offensive and defensive functions, with mobility systems that allowed rapid vertical and horizontal repositioning. Sensor arrays and targeting systems were noted for their precision and integration, enabling coordinated fire across multiple units without reliance on the more hierarchical command structures typical of Imperial forces. These observations were recorded in technical appendices, often accompanied by schematic interpretations and comparative analysis with known Imperial technologies. While the tone remained analytical, there is a consistent undercurrent of recognition that these systems represented a form of efficiency that warranted further study, even if doctrinal constraints limited direct application. Logistical data gathered during the Crusade forms one of the most detailed components of administratum reporting. Supply chain analysis revealed that operations across the Damocles Gulf required significantly greater resource allocation than initially projected. Transit times for material and personnel increased as the Crusade advanced, with resupply intervals extending beyond optimal thresholds for sustained offensive operations. Fuel consumption for naval vessels, maintenance requirements for armoured units, and attrition rates among infantry regiments all contributed to a cumulative strain that reduced operational flexibility over time. Administratum logisticians recorded that the Crusade structure, while sufficient for a rapid, punitive campaign, was not optimized for prolonged engagement in a region with limited established infrastructure. The absence of reliable forward supply bases necessitated the use of mobile logistics platforms and extended supply lines, both of which were vulnerable to disruption. While there is limited evidence that two forces directly targeted these supply lines in the early stages, the inherent inefficiencies of distance and coordination were sufficient to create measurable degradation in operational tempo. Mechanicus data complements these findings with detailed accounts of equipment performance and maintenance cycles. Reports indicate that Imperial machinery, while robust and effective under standard conditions, required increased maintenance when operating in environments where supply delays limited access to replacement parts and specialised labour. In contrast, Tau equipment encountered during the campaign was frequently described as modular and adaptable, with components that could be replaced or repaired with relative efficiency. This distinction did not translate into immediate battlefield superiority, but it contributed to the Tau ability to sustain operations in contested areas without the same level of logistical burden. Another key observation recorded by both institutions concerns the integration of multiple operational domains within Tau strategy. Administratum analysts noted that Tau forces did not treat ground, air, and orbital operations as separate phases of engagement, but rather as interconnected elements of a unified approach. Engagements often involved simultaneous pressure across these domains, forcing Imperial forces to divide attention and resources. Mechanicus observers attributed this capability to advanced communication systems and data integration technologies, which allowed for real-time coordination across dispersed units. The Administratum also recorded notable variations in engagement outcomes, depending on the composition and command structure of Imperial forces involved. Units operating under flexible command conditions, with the ability to adapt tactics based on evolving battlefield conditions, demonstrated higher success rates in engagements with Tau forces. Conversely, formations adhering strictly to pre-established doctrines without adjustment experienced greater difficulty in responding to the fluid nature of Tau operations. These findings were documented as part of post-engagement reviews, with recommendations for increased emphasis on adaptive command practices in future campaigns against similarly structured adversaries. Mechanicus entries further detail the importance of data acquisition during the campaign. Recovered TU equipment, sensor logs, and battlefield telemetry were subjected to extensive analysis. While much of this data was classified and restricted, summary reports indicate that the Mechanicus prioritized understanding the underlying principles of Tau technology, particularly in areas related to energy efficiency, targeting systems, and mobility platforms. The tone of these reports remains consistent with doctrinal expectations, emphasizing the need to categorize and contain Xenos technology, but the depth of analysis suggests a recognition of its practical significance. Environmental observations also played a role in shaping strategic assessments. Several worlds within the campaign zone presented conditions that influenced both Imperial and Tau operations, including varied terrain, atmospheric composition, and local resource availability. Administratum records note that Tau forces demonstrated a capacity to adapt to these conditions with relative speed, deploying units and equipment suited to specific environments. Mechanicus observers linked this adaptability to the modular design of Tau systems and the integration of environmental data into operational planning. In summary, the combined records of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus present the Damocles Gulf Crusade as a campaign that yielded significant strategic and logistical insights, even in the absence of a definitive military resolution. The impressions recorded by these institutions reflect a gradual shift from initial confidence to measured reassessment, driven by direct observation and accumulated data. Strategic findings emphasize the need to account for adaptable, technologically integrated adversaries, while logistical data underscores the importance of aligning campaign structure with operational realities. These records do not frame the campaign as a deviation from Imperial capability, but as an instance in which established assumptions required refinement. The Tau Empire, as observed through the lens of these institutions, is characterized not only as a military opponent, but as a system whose methods of expansion, integration, and warfare differ in ways that have measurable impact on campaign dynamics. The data gathered during the Crusade therefore serves not only as a record of past engagements, but as a foundation for future strategic planning in regions where similar conditions may arise. Administratum war ledgers and Mechanicus engagement records identify several major confrontations within the Damocles Gulf Crusade that illustrate the transition from localized enforcement actions to structured interstellar warfare. These records do not isolate battles as singular heroic narratives, but instead present them as case studies in operational adaptation, technological contrast, and doctrinal friction between Imperial and Tau methods of war. One of the earliest major engagements recorded with sufficient detail occurred during the campaign against the world of Daleth. Administratum logs describe the advance toward the system as initially consistent with prior projections, with Imperial naval elements establishing orbital presence and preparing for ground deployment under the assumption of manageable resistance. Early reconnaissance suggested a fortified environment, but not one beyond the expected capacity of a Crusade force to overcome. This assessment was revised rapidly once coordinated Tau resistance was encountered. Mechanicus sensor analysis from the engagement indicates that Tau defensive preparations were neither static nor purely reactive. Instead of relying solely on fixed fortifications, Tau forces deployed layered defense networks combining mobile battlesuit units, aerial support craft, and ground-based infantry formations equipped with advanced ranged weaponry. Engagement distances were consistently maintained beyond optimal close combat range, forcing Imperial units to advance under sustained fire while attempting to close the distance. This resulted in elevated attrition rates among forward elements, particularly within Imperial Guard formations tasked with establishing initial footholds. Administrium reports emphasize the difficulty of imposing traditional siege patterns under these conditions. Tau units demonstrated a consistent pattern of withdrawal and redeployment, abandoning positions before they could be decisively overrun and reappearing at points of tactical advantage. This created the appearance of a fragmented defense, but in practice functioned as a cohesive system of controlled engagement. Imperial commanders noted that attempts to fix Tau forces in place often resulted in exposure to flanking fire or aerial attack, complicating efforts to establish stable front lines. A subsequent and more complex series of engagements occurred during the assault on the world of Borken, which Mechanicus records identify as a centre of technological significance within the Tau Empire. The importance of this target elevated the scale and intensity of the conflict, prompting a higher degree of coordination among Tau forces. Administratum entries describe the approach to Borken as encountering increased resistance not only in orbital space, but also in the form of defensive infrastructure integrated into the planetary environment. Mechanicus analysis highlights the use of advanced shielding systems, energy-based defensive arrays, and automated support structures that enhance the survivability of Tau positions. These systems did not render Tau forces invulnerable, but they increased the resource expenditure required for Imperial forces to achieve comparable tactical gains. The presence of such systems also demonstrated a level of technological specialization that exceeded initial Imperial estimates of Tau capabilities. Fighting styles observed during the Borken engagements reflect a continuation and refinement of earlier Tau tactics. Firecast units operated in coordinated formations, utilizing combined arms integration to maintain pressure while minimizing direct exposure. Battlesuit units served as both offensive platforms and mobile command nodes, directing fire and adjusting positions in response to Imperial movements. Crute auxiliaries were deployed in terrain where their adaptability provided advantages in reconnaissance and close-range engagement, supplementing the more technologically oriented elements of the Tau military structure. Imperial responses to these tactics varied depending on the composition and command structure of the forces involved. Space Marine contingents achieved localized success through rapid insertion and concentrated assault, exploiting moments where Tau repositioning created temporary vulnerabilities. These actions, while effective on a tactical level, did not always translate into sustained strategic advantage, as Tau forces demonstrated the ability to absorb localized losses and reconfigure their defensive posture. Imperial Guard formations operating at larger scales relied on sustained pressure and numerical superiority to advance. Administratum records note that progress was often measured in incremental gains, rather than decisive breakthroughs. Artillery and armoured units played a significant role in this process, providing the firepower necessary to suppress Tau positions and create opportunities for infantry advancement. However, the mobility of Tau forces frequently reduced the effectiveness of static bombardment. as targets could relocate before sustained fire achieved its intended effect. Naval engagements during this phase also provide insight into the evolving nature of the conflict. Mechanicus sensor logs describe Tau vessels as employing coordinated maneuver patterns that emphasize positioning and overlapping fields of fire. While Imperial ships retained advantages in durability and raw firepower, Tau fleets demonstrated efficiency in movement and target acquisition. Engagements were characterized by attempts on both sides to control engagement range, with the Imperium seeking to bring its heavier weapons to bear and the Tau attempting to exploit mobility to mitigate this advantage. Another notable aspect of these battles is the increasing role of environmental adaptation. Administratum records indicate that Tau forces consistently selected or modified engagement zones to align with their tactical strengths. Terrain features were used to limit line of sight, channel Imperial advances, and create opportunities for ambush or crossfire. Mechanicus observers attribute this to both pre-existing environmental analysis and the integration of real-time data into operational planning, allowing Tau units to adjust to changing conditions with minimal delay. As the campaign progressed, a pattern emerged in which Imperial forces adapted their own tactics in response to these observations. Administratum after-action reports document an increased emphasis on flexible command structures, reconnaissance, and the coordination of multiple unit types to counter Tau mobility. Space Marine units were often deployed to disrupt Tau command and control elements, while Guard formations adjusted their advance patterns to reduce exposure to ranged fire and flanking maneuvers. Mechanicus entries further detail the collection and analysis of battlefield data during these engagements. Recovered equipment, sensor recordings, and engagement telemetry were used to construct models of Tau operational behavior. These models informed subsequent tactical adjustments, contributing to a gradual improvement in Imperial performance against Tau forces. However, the rate of adaptation was constrained by the scale and complexity of Imperial command structures, as well as the logistical challenges inherent in the campaign. The cumulative effect of these battles was not a clear dominance by either side, but a progressive escalation in both capability and understanding. Each engagement contributed to a growing body of knowledge that reshaped expectations and informed future operations. Administratum records emphasize that the campaign's value extended beyond territorial gains, serving as a critical source of data on a previously under-examined adversary. Mechanicus summaries reinforce this perspective, noting that the technological and tactical insights gained during the Damocles Gulf Crusade provided a foundation for ongoing study and future engagement planning. The battles of Dalith, Borkan, and other contested worlds are therefore recorded not only as instances of conflict, but as points of reference in the broader process of adapting Imperial doctrine to new forms of warfare. In conclusion, the notable wars and battles of the Damocles Gulf Crusade illustrate a dynamic interaction between established Imperial methods and emerging Tau strategies. Fighting styles on both sides evolved in response to direct experience, with each engagement contributing to a more refined understanding of the opponent. The details preserved in Administratum and Mechanicus records provide a comprehensive view of these interactions, highlighting the complexity of the conflict and the importance of continuous adaptation in the face of an evolving adversary. Administratum continuations and Mechanicus annexes extend beyond the principal engagements to record a broader distribution of conflicts that occurred across secondary systems, orbital lanes, and transitional supply corridors during the latter phases of the Damocles Gulf Crusade. These additional wars and engagements, while individually smaller in scale than the major assaults on set worlds, collectively contributed to the operational character of the campaign and provided a more complete representation of the conflict's distributed nature. One category of engagements frequently referenced in Administratum records concerns interdiction operations conducted along supply routes connecting Imperial staging points to forward deployment zones. These operations were not originally anticipated to encounter significant resistance beyond opportunistic piracy or isolated Xenos interference. However, as the campaign progressed, reports indicate that Tau forces increasingly targeted these routes with calculated precision, Rather than committing to large-scale fleet engagements, TOW naval elements employed limited, coordinated strikes designed to disrupt transport vessels, delay reinforcements, and impose additional strain on Imperial logistics. Mechanicus sensor logs describe these engagements as characterized by short-duration contact windows, high maneuver variability, and rapid disengagement once objectives were achieved. TOW vessels did not seek to destroy entire convoys unless favorable conditions presented themselves. Instead, they focused on disabling key ships, damaging critical cargo, or forcing rerouting that extended supply timelines. This pattern of engagement, when repeated across multiple routes, contributed to measurable degradation in the consistency and predictability of Imperial supply chains. Ground-level conflicts in secondary systems exhibit similar patterns of distributed resistance. Administratum field reports from worlds reclaimed earlier in the campaign note recurring instances of renewed hostility, often in regions where TOW presence had not been entirely eliminated. These engagements were typically localized, involving mixed forces of remaining TOW units and human collaborators who had not been fully integrated back into Imperial structures. While these actions did not threaten overall control of the systems, they required ongoing deployment of Imperial Guard units to maintain stability, further extending the operational burden of the Crusade. Mechanicus observations of these engagements emphasize the persistence of TIU technological influence even after formal withdrawal from certain areas. Recovered equipment, improvised adaptations of TOW devices, and remnants of communication networks continued to appear in regions where TOW forces were no longer present in significant numbers. This persistence complicated efforts to fully restore pre-contact conditions, as it indicated that the material and procedural changes introduced during TOW occupation could not be easily reversed. Additional battle records also include engagements in orbital space that did not reach the scale of fleet-wide confrontations, but nonetheless influence campaign dynamics. Administratum naval logs describe repeated encounters in which Imperial vessels attempted to assert control over transit corridors, only to face intermittent resistance from TOW craft operating in dispersed formations. These engagements rarely resulted in decisive outcomes, but they imposed continuous demands on Imperial naval resources, requiring vessels to remain in contested areas rather than consolidating for larger operations. Mechanicus analysis of these orbital engagements highlights the efficiency of TOW coordination systems, which allowed smaller units to operate with the degree of cohesion typically associated with larger formations. Data suggests that TOW vessels maintained synchronized targeting and movement patterns even when separated by significant distances, indicating a level of communication integration that reduced the need for centralized command structures during combat. This capability contributed to the TOW strategy of distributed engagement, enabling them to apply pressure across multiple points without concentrating forces in a manner that would expose them to overwhelming Imperial firepower. As the campaign approached its conclusion, Administratum records begin to shift focus from active engagement to consolidation and withdrawal procedures. The decision to redeploy Imperial forces in response to the emerging Tyranid threat introduced a new set of logistical challenges. Units engaged in ongoing operations were required to disengage, reorganize, and prepare for transit to other theatres, often under conditions where local stability had not been fully secured. This transition phase is documented as one of controlled contraction, with priority given to preserving personnel, equipment, and command integrity. Mechanicus reports from this phase detail the procedures used to recover or neutralize equipment that could not be transported. In cases where Imperial technology risked capture or misuse, standard protocols were followed to ensure its destruction or deactivation. Similarly, efforts were made to deny TOW forces access to strategic assets left behind during withdrawal. These actions reflect the broader principle of resource control that governed Mechanicus operations, extending beyond active combat into the management of material consequences following disengagement. The aftermath of the Damocles Gulf Crusade, as recorded by both institutions, is characterized by a combination of partial restoration and enduring uncertainty. Administratum summaries note that several worlds were successfully returned to imperial governance, with administrative structures re-established and compliance enforced through a continued military presence. However, these records also acknowledge that the conditions which allowed Tau influence to take root were not entirely eliminated. Frontier distance, resource limitations, and local variability remained factors that could influence future stability. Mechanicus' conclusions focus on the technological and analytical outcomes of the campaign. The data collected on Tau systems, both in combat and through recovered materials, is identified as a significant addition to existing knowledge of Xenos capabilities. While direct application of this knowledge is constrained by doctrinal restrictions, the value of understanding these systems for purposes of countermeasure development is emphasized. The campaign is therefore framed as an opportunity to expand the empirical basis upon which future engagements with the Tau or similar adversaries may be approached. A notable aspect of the aftermath is the recognition that the Tau Empire was neither destroyed nor rendered incapable of further expansion. Administratum assessments describe the outcome as a containment of immediate influence rather than a permanent resolution. Tau forces, though compelled to withdraw in the face of imperial pressure, retained their core infrastructure and strategic capacity. This reality is reflected in subsequent records that treat the Tau not as a defeated adversary, but as an ongoing presence requiring continued monitoring and potential future engagement. The conclusion drawn from combined Administratum and Mechanicus records is therefore one of qualified assessment. The Damocles Gulf Crusade achieved several of its immediate objectives, including the reassertion of imperial authority over compromised worlds and the disruption of Tau expansion within the contested region. At the same time, it exposed limitations in both strategic planning and logistical execution when operating against an adaptable and technologically integrated opponent. From an administratum perspective, the campaign underscores the importance of aligning operational scope with available resources and the broader strategic environment. The necessity of redeployment in response to the Tyranid threat illustrates the interconnected nature of imperial military commitments, where actions in one region are inevitably influenced by developments in another. From a Mechanicus perspective, the campaign highlights the value of systematic observation, data collection, and analysis in understanding emerging threats, even when doctrinal constraints limit direct technological integration. In final assessment, the Damocles Gulf Crusade is recorded not as a conclusive victory or defeat, but as a foundational encounter that redefined imperial understanding of the Tau Empire. The additional wars and engagements documented across the campaign contribute to a comprehensive view of its complexity, demonstrating that even secondary conflicts play a role in shaping overall outcomes. The aftermath reflects a balance between restored control and unresolved tension, establishing conditions under which future interactions between the Imperium and the Tau would continue to develop. Inquisitorial records concerning the Damocles Gulf Crusade diverge in tone and emphasis from those of the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Where the latter document operational efficiency, material performance, and strategic adjustment, the Inquisition focuses on deviation, anomaly, and the potential for corruption that cannot be quantified through conventional means. The earliest compiled impressions do not begin with battlefield summaries, but with patterns observed in human behavior across the affected frontier systems. These patterns are recorded not as isolated cases of disobedience, but as indicators of systemic ideological displacement. Inquisitorial observers noted that populations exposed to Tau presence did not exhibit the expected psychological fragmentation typically associated with alien influence. Instead, reports describe structured compliance, cooperative civic function, and a measurable reduction in internal conflict within certain settlements. This observation is recorded with caution and suspicion. In standard doctrinal interpretation, deviation from imperial orthodoxy, particularly under Xenos influence, is expected to produce instability, cult formation, or visible signs of coercion. The absence of these indicators is treated not as evidence of benign governance, but as a potential concealment of influence operating through mechanisms not yet understood. Interrogation transcripts from recovered individuals provide further detail. Subjects identified as having direct contact with two envoys consistently describe their interactions in terms of negotiation, mutual benefit, and structured agreement. Notably absent from many accounts are descriptions of overt force, psychic manipulation, or coercive conversion. This consistency across multiple testimonies is flagged within inquisitorial summaries as an anomaly requiring further investigation. The possibility that compliance could be achieved through non-coercive means challenges established assumptions regarding Xenos-human interaction and introduces the question of whether ideological influence alone can produce durable loyalty shifts. Several inquisitorial agents recorded personal observations during field deployment on reclaimed worlds. These entries describe environments in which remnants of Tau administrative systems remained partially intact, even after Imperial reoccupation. In some cases, infrastructure continued to function with minimal disruption, and local populations demonstrated familiarity with organizational structures that differed from Imperial norms. The persistence of these systems, despite active efforts to remove them, is noted as a form of residual influence that extends beyond physical presence. It is not treated as simple technological contamination, but as an embedded pattern of behavior that may continue to affect local populations over time. Unexplainable findings begin to appear more frequently in reports compiled during the middle phase of the campaign. One recurring observation concerns the apparent absence of psychic signatures typically associated with large-scale alien activity. In a galaxy where warp interaction is a constant factor in both travel and warfare, the relative silence of Tau operations in the psychic domain is recorded as highly irregular. Astropathic logs from multiple systems note reduced interference and an absence of warp-related disturbances in areas where Tau forces were active. This phenomenon is not presented as an advantage or disadvantage, but as a deviation from expected norms that complicates traditional methods of detection and analysis. Further entries speculate on the implications of this absence. Some inquisitorial analysts propose that the Tau possess a limited or entirely absent presence within the warp, reducing their visibility to psychic observation. Others suggest that their methods of operation may intentionally avoid warp interaction, relying instead on technological systems that bypass the need for psychic integration. Both interpretations remain unconfirmed, and records consistently emphasize that the lack of warp signature does not equate to a lack of threat. Instead, it represents a form of concealment that operates outside established detection frameworks. Another category of unexplainable findings involves the behavior of Tau-aligned auxiliary species, particularly those integrated into their military structure. Observations of Kroot units, for example, indicate a level of biological adaptability that exceeds standard classifications. Inquisitorial notes describe variations in physical characteristics, dietary patterns, and combat behavior that appear to correlate with environmental conditions and recent engagements. While the Mechanicus records these traits in biological and functional terms, the Inquisition frames them as potential indicators of deeper instability or mutation pathways that could pose long-term risks if left unexamined. In several instances, field agents reported encounters with Tau command structures that exhibited a level of coordination difficult to attribute solely to conventional communication systems. Engagement logs describe rapid shifts in tactical alignment, synchronized movement across dispersed units, and an apparent anticipation of Imperial maneuvers that exceeded what would be expected from standard reconnaissance. These observations are not attributed to psychic communication, given the previously noted absence of warp signatures, but they are nonetheless classified as anomalous. The possibility of advanced data integration or predictive modeling is acknowledged, but not fully understood within the context of existing Imperial frameworks. Inquisitorial impressions of the Tau themselves are recorded with a degree of restraint, reflecting both the limited direct exposure and the need to avoid premature conclusions. Physical descriptions are noted as consistent across encounters: bipedal forms, distinct cranial structure, and uniformity in presentation that suggest a highly regulated social order. However, the focus of these records is less on physical characteristics and more on behavioural patterns. Tau individuals are described as exhibiting controlled emotional expression, adherence to defined roles, and a collective orientation that prioritises group objectives over individual initiative. This behavioural consistency is interpreted as both a strength and a potential vulnerability, though the mechanisms underlying it remain unclear. One of the more persistent themes in Inquisitorial analysis is the question of how the Tau maintain cohesion across multiple species and cultural systems. Reports consistently note the absence of visible coercion mechanisms typically required to enforce such integration. Auxiliary forces operate alongside Tau units with apparent coordination and shared objectives, raising questions about the nature of the agreements or influences that sustain this alignment. Some analysts suggest that the concept referred to by the Tau as the greater good functions as an ideological framework capable of unifying disparate groups. Others consider the possibility of more subtle forms of influence, whether psychological, cultural, or otherwise, that have yet to be fully identified. Unconfirmed reports, marked explicitly as speculative within Inquisitorial archives, introduce the possibility that certain elements of Tau leadership may possess characteristics that facilitate this cohesion beyond standard socio-political structures. These reports often reference the ethereal caste, suggesting that their presence correlates with increased stability and coordination among Tau forces. However, direct evidence supporting any extraordinary capabilities remains limited, and such claims are consistently categorized as requiring further verification. The Inquisition also records anomalies related to battlefield aftermaths. In several engagements, Imperial forces reported difficulty in recovering intacto command units or high-ranking personnel. Withdrawals were executed with a level of precision that minimized the capture of critical assets, and in some cases, equipment left behind appeared to have been intentionally disabled or rendered inoperable. This pattern is interpreted as evidence of preemptive contingency planning, designed to limit the amount of actionable intelligence available to Imperial investigators. In summary, Inquisitorial impressions of the Damocles Gulf Crusade emphasize uncertainty and deviation from established expectations. Observations focus on the absence of anticipated indicators, the presence of structured yet unexplained behaviors, and the potential for forms of influence that operate outside conventional detection methods. Unexplainable findings are not treated as isolated curiosities, but as components of a broader pattern that challenges existing frameworks for understanding Xenos threats. These records do not attempt to resolve the anomalies they document. Instead, they preserve them as points of reference for continued investigation. The Damocles Gulf Crusade, from the Inquisition's perspective, is not only a military encounter, but an exposure to a system whose methods and effects are not fully understood. The implications of this exposure extend beyond the immediate conflict, suggesting that future engagements with the Tau may require new approaches to detection, analysis, and response. Inquisitorial archives relating to the Damocles Gulf Crusade expand in depth and specificity when addressing direct encounters and sealed case material. These records do not follow conventional campaign chronology, but instead compile verified incidents, interrogations, restricted field observations, and sealed annotations that were deemed too irregular or inconclusive for broader dissemination. Each entry is structured not around victory or loss, but around deviation from expected patterns of behavior, perception, and environmental response. Documented encounters begin with repeated contact scenarios involving Imperial reconnaissance units and Tau forward elements operating within recently contested systems. In several instances, Inquisitorial observers embedded within Imperial command structures recorded that Tau forces demonstrated a consistent reluctance to initiate immediate lethal engagement when first contact was established. Instead, there are verified cases where Tau units attempted to communicate, even during active military operations, utilizing translated low-Gothic broadcasts or intermediary human agents. These attempts were not prolonged, nor were they consistently successful, but their recurrence is noted as atypical within the context of known hostile Xenos behaviour. Inquisitorial annotations accompanying these records emphasise that such actions were not to be interpreted as weakness or hesitation. Rather, they are categorised as strategic probes, intended to assess the possibility of compliance or delay engagement under controlled conditions. In several cases, Imperial units that did not respond immediately with force reported brief operational pauses during which Tau units withdrew without escalation. These encounters are preserved as examples of an adversary employing conditional engagement thresholds rather than absolute hostility. Further documented encounters involve Imperial forces reclaiming settlements previously under Tau influence. In these scenarios, Inquisitorial agents were present during the initial stages of reintegration, conducting assessments of population behaviour and environmental conditions. Reports consistently describe populations exhibiting reduced resistance during initial Imperial arrival, followed by gradual destabilisation once enforcement measures were enacted. This pattern is recorded as a delayed reaction, differing from standard rebellion models where resistance is immediate and overt. Interrogation records from these populations reveal a recurring structure in testimony. Subjects frequently describe Tau governance in terms of order, predictability, and mutual obligation. Notably, these descriptions persist even after exposure to Imperial reconditioning efforts, suggesting a form of ideological retention that is resistant to rapid reversal. Inquisitorial summaries classify this as a low-intensity but persistent influence vector, requiring extended monitoring beyond initial compliance verification. Recorded anomalies during active engagements form a significant portion of sealed reports. One recurring anomaly involves the synchronization of Tau unit responses across distances that exceed standard communication delay thresholds. Engagement logs from multiple systems describe scenarios in which dispersed Tau formations adjusted position and targeting parameters within intervals that suggest near-instantaneous coordination. Mechanicus explanations attribute this to advanced communication systems, but Inquisitorial notes maintain that the observed efficiency exceeds what can be confirmed through recovered technology alone. Another anomaly concerns the behaviour of Tau command withdrawals. In several high-intensity engagements, Imperial forces reported the abrupt disengagement of Tau leadership elements shortly before the collapse of surrounding units. These withdrawals were executed with precision timing, often preceding events that would have resulted in the capture or elimination of command personnel. Inquisitorial analysis raises the possibility of predictive modelling or pre-calculated engagement thresholds, though no definitive mechanism is confirmed. The consistency of this behaviour across multiple engagements leads to its classification as a structured operational pattern rather than coincidence. Environmental anomalies are also documented in sealed field reports. In certain engagement zones, Inquisitorial agents recorded irregularities in sensor readings that could not be directly attributed to known Tau technology. These include localized disruptions in Auspex clarity, intermittent signal degradation, and transient distortions in thermal imaging. While these effects were not sustained and did not result in catastrophic system failure, their occurrence during key phases of engagement is noted as potentially intentional. Mechanicus analysis remains inconclusive, and Inquisitorial classification retains these incidents as unresolved. Additional reports focus on the integration of auxiliary species with inter-operational structures. Inquisitorial observers documented encounters where Kroot units operated in close coordination with fire caste forces, demonstrating an ability to transition between reconnaissance, ambush, and direct engagement roles with minimal delay. While the biological adaptability of these units is recognized, certain behavioral patterns observed during prolonged engagements suggest a level of coordination that extends beyond standard command relay. These observations are marked as requiring further investigation, particularly in relation to how command directives are disseminated across species boundaries. Sealed reports also include references to recovered materials and devices that exhibit properties not immediately classifiable within existing Mechanicus frameworks. These items, often retrieved from abandoned Tau positions, were subjected to restricted analysis due to their unknown functions. Inquisitorial notes accompanying these analyses emphasize caution, highlighting the potential for concealed mechanisms or unintended effects during examination. While no explicit evidence of hazardous properties is confirmed in the available summaries, the decision to seal these reports indicates a level of uncertainty deemed significant by overseeing authorities. One of the more heavily restricted categories of documentation involves observations related to Tau leadership presence during engagements. Several field agents reported a measurable shift in unit cohesion and responsiveness when specific command figures were identified within operational zones. These observations are not accompanied by direct evidence of anomalous capability, but the correlation between leadership presence and enhanced coordination is consistently noted. Speculative annotations reference the possibility of influence mechanisms that are not yet understood, though such interpretations remain unverified and are explicitly labelled as conjectural. Another sealed report category addresses the absence of expected post-engagement artifacts. In multiple engagements, Imperial forces reported difficulty in recovering intact data cores, command interfaces, or high-value technological components from Tau positions. Equipment that was not removed during withdrawal often exhibited signs of deliberate deactivation or internal disruption, rendering it unsuitable for immediate analysis. This pattern is interpreted as a form of operational denial, preventing the accumulation of actionable intelligence by Imperial forces. The efficiency and consistency of this practice are noted as indicators of pre-established contingency protocols within two command structures. Inquisitorial records also document isolated cases of human intermediaries operating alongside two forces during engagements. These individuals, identified as collaborators or integrated agents, were observed facilitating communication, translation, and logistical coordination. Their presence complicates the classification of encounters as they occupy a position between opposing forces. Interrogation of captured individuals reveals varying degrees of allegiance, with some expressing continued alignment with Tau objectives despite capture. These cases are treated as high-priority subjects for further analysis, given their potential role in extending Tau influence within human populations. The cumulative effect of these documented encounters and anomalies is reflected in the tone of inquisitorial summaries. Unlike administratum or mechanicus records, which emphasize adaptation and data accumulation, inquisitorial reports maintain a consistent focus on uncertainty and unresolved variables. Each anomaly is preserved as an open question rather than a resolved finding, contributing to a broader framework of ongoing investigation. Sealed reports conclude with a series of provisional classifications rather than definitive statements. The Tau Empire is identified as an adversary whose methods of operation include elements that cannot be fully explained through existing imperial models of warfare, technology, or governance. The absence of warp signature, the persistence of ideological influence, the efficiency of coordinated action, and the controlled denial of recoverable assets collectively define a profile that resists complete categorization. These records do not attempt to impose final interpretation on the events they describe. Instead, they function as a repository of observed phenomena intended to inform future inquiry and operational planning. From the Inquisition's perspective, the Damocles Gulf Crusade represents not only a military confrontation, but an exposure to a system of influence and coordination that remains partially obscured. The anomalies recorded within these sealed reports are therefore not treated as isolated irregularities, but as indicators of underlying mechanisms that have yet to be fully understood or countered. Classified inquisitorial files compiled in the aftermath of the Damocles Gulf Crusade do not present a unified conclusion. Instead, they form a layered archive of restricted assessments, cross-referenced anomalies, and provisional threat designations that remain open to revision. These documents are not written for broad dissemination, but for internal circulation among Ordo's representatives tasked with long-term monitoring of emerging Xenos patterns. The tone is deliberate, controlled, and consistently unresolved. The first category of classified material concerns ideological persistence within reclaimed populations. follow-up investigations conducted cycles after Imperial reoccupation reveal that behavioural normalisation did not fully align with pre-contact baselines. While overt compliance was restored, subtle deviations in social organisation, cooperative behaviour, and conflict resolution remained detectable. These deviations did not manifest as organised rebellion, nor did they trigger immediate doctrinal alarms under standard assessment criteria. However, longitudinal observation suggests that exposure to Tau systems introduced a durable shift in local expectations of governance and interaction. Inquisitorial analysts note that these shifts are not uniform across all reclaimed worlds. Variability appears linked to duration of exposure, depth of integration, and the presence of intermediary agents during occupation. In systems where Tor influence was brief or primarily military, reversion to imperial norms occurred with minimal resistance. In systems where administrative and economic structures had been fully established, reversion required sustained enforcement and continuous monitoring. The persistence of these patterns is classified as a low-visibility risk factor, requiring periodic reassessment rather than immediate purgation. A second category of classified files addresses the absence of conventional corruption markers. Across multiple investigated systems, Inquisitorial agents report no evidence of warp-based contamination, demonic influence, or psycho-linked disruption associated with Tau presence. This absence is not treated as confirmation of purity, but as an operational blind spot. Standard detection frameworks, heavily reliant on warp interaction indicators, provide limited insight into systems that function outside that domain. The implication, recorded with caution, is that the two represent a form of influence that bypasses established early warning mechanisms. Cross-referenced astropathic logs reinforce this assessment. Regions previously occupied or contested by Tau forces show no residual psychic disturbance beyond baseline fluctuations. This consistency is maintained even in zones of prolonged engagement, where conventional conflict would typically produce detectable warp echoes. The lack of such indicators complicates retrospective analysis, as it removes a key layer of verification used in identifying hidden threats. Classified annotations describe this condition as an absence of signal rather than evidence of safety. Further classified entries examine command structure anomalies observed during the campaign. Particular attention is given to the role of the Tau ethereal caste. While direct evidence remains limited, multiple field reports correlate the presence of ethereal figures with increased cohesion, reduced hesitation, and heightened synchronization among Tau units. This correlation persists across independent observations and is sufficiently consistent to warrant restricted analysis. Speculative interpretations within these files propose that ethereal presence may exert a form of influence not currently understood within Imperial frameworks. Suggested mechanisms include psychological conditioning, cultural reinforcement, or unidentified biological factors. None of these hypotheses are confirmed, and all are explicitly marked as requiring further investigation. The lack of measurable warp activity associated with these effects further complicates classification, placing them outside conventional categories of psychic or technological influence. Additional classified material focuses on communication and coordination systems employed by Tau forces. Mechanicus provided data, combined with inquisitorial field observations, indicates that Tau units maintain operational cohesion across distances and conditions that would degrade standard Imperial command efficiency. While advanced technology accounts for part of this capability, certain engagement records suggest a level of responsiveness that exceeds expected latency thresholds. Inquisitorial analysts refrain from attributing this entirely to technological superiority. Instead, they categorize it as an integrated system in which communication, doctrine, and behavioral conditioning function as a unified whole. This interpretation aligns with observed patterns of rapid adaptation and coordinated withdrawal, particularly in scenarios where Tau forces disengaged prior to encirclement or capture. The precision of these actions suggests pre-established parameters governing engagement duration and acceptable loss thresholds. Recovered equipment and denied assets form another area of classified concern. Across multiple engagements, Imperial forces reported consistent difficulty in securing intact Tau command interfaces, data storage units, or high-value technological components. Devices that remained accessible were frequently rendered inoperable through internal mechanisms that activated upon abandonment or compromise. Inquisitorial review of these incidents concludes that Tau forces employ systematic denial protocols designed to prevent intelligence acquisition. The effectiveness of these protocols limits the depth of analysis possible through material recovery. While partial data has been extracted from damaged systems, the absence of complete datasets restricts the ability to construct comprehensive models of Tau command architecture. Classified annotations emphasize that this limitation should not be interpreted as a failure of recovery efforts, but as an indication of deliberate adversarial design. Human intermediary cases remain among the most sensitive files within the archive. Individuals identified as collaborators or integrated agents exhibit a range of responses during interrogation, from continued alignment with Tau objectives to partial compliance with Imperial authority. A subset of these individuals demonstrates resilience to standard reconditioning procedures, maintaining consistent belief structures despite exposure to corrective measures. Inquisitorial analysis of these cases identifies no singular mechanism responsible for this resilience. Instead, it is attributed to a combination of ideological adoption, perceived stability under Tau governance, and the absence of coercive trauma typically associated with forced compliance. This combination produces a form of allegiance that is not easily disrupted through conventional means. Classified recommendations advise extended observation and controlled reintegration rather than immediate termination, citing the potential value of these individuals as sources of insight into Tau influence mechanisms. Environmental and technological anomalies recorded during the campaign remain unresolved within classified summaries. Instances of sensor disruption, transient data inconsistencies, and localized interference are catalogued without definitive attribution. Mechanicus input provides potential technical explanations, but inquisitorial review maintains these entries as open cases pending further evidence. The decision to retain these anomalies within classified status reflects their potential relevance to future encounters, particularly if similar patterns are observed in subsequent campaigns. Final thoughts within the Inquisition's classified archive do not attempt to resolve the Damocles Gulf Crusade into a singular outcome. Instead, they frame the event as an initial exposure to a form of adversary that does not conform to established categories of threat. The Tau Empire is not characterized by overwhelming psychic presence, uncontrollable mutation, or purely destructive intent. Its methods operate through integration, coordination, and controlled expansion, producing effects that are measurable, but not immediately attributable to known mechanisms. This distinction is emphasized repeatedly across concluding entries. The absence of familiar threat indicators does not reduce the level of concern. On the contrary, it necessitates the development of new frameworks for detection and analysis. The Inquisition's role, as defined within these files, is not only to respond to threats that are fully understood, but to identify and monitor those that challenge existing understanding. The Damocles Gulf Crusade therefore occupies a specific position within Inquisitorial records. It is not classified as a resolved conflict, nor as a contained anomaly. It is recorded as an ongoing reference point, a dataset of encounters and observations that inform future operations. The lack of definitive conclusions is not treated as a deficiency, but as an accurate reflection of the current state of knowledge. In closing, the classified files do not provide closure in the conventional sense. They establish parameters for continued vigilance. The Tau Empire is recognized as an entity whose methods require sustained observation, whose influence persists beyond immediate occupation, and whose operational patterns remain partially obscured. The Inquisition's final position is one of measured uncertainty, supported by documented evidence and preserved for future scrutiny.